What we're talking about today is a title that we sanitized slightly from the one that we used at a medical group several years ago called Finding Occult Influences in Health and Disease. We used occult in the most rigid possible form. Got a lot of distortion on one of these folks.
Get on another mic.
Let's try the one that Eldon just had. He sounded pretty good. I believe the batteries are totally gone in this. Yeah, this is the one that has the harmonic distortion. Swap you even. Okay, this battery light isn't coming on very... Okay, this does sound a little better, doesn't it? Okay. We called this Finding Occult Influences in Health and Disease, and we used occult in the most rigid dictionary definition, which simply meant hidden. Now, before Louis Pasteur looked through his microscope, those little germs, those bacteria, those microbes were hidden until he had the instruments to actually see what was happening when he was trying to save the wine industry of France. Most educated Middle Europeans didn't realize that something a few microns long that they had not seen could cause a 6'2" man to be deathly ill. Up until that time, a third of Middle Europe was wiped out by bubonic plague, cholera, etc., by these occult influences, hidden influences, which in this case were germs. And we always put in this disclaimer. We also say that this is some of the best information that we can come by at the moment. That any opinions that I express up here today are not cast in cement. When we come across better data, we'll pass it along to you. So forgive me if I have egg on my face on some of these points. A lot of information has been developed in the last few years about the hazards of the toxic office. A lot of articles have appeared in the popular press about indoor pollution, which up until the last few years had meant formaldehydes, insecticides, mercury vapor, etc. Today, the largest potential toxic pollutant is electromagnetic fields, which are coming from either deliberately manipulated, well, we'll talk about some of the things that I've found during the years that I've been doing electromagnetic ghostbusting for free. I've never charged anyone a nickel for this. I've used a lot of toxic offices and homes and restaurants simply as experimental databases until we came up with firm information pointing out to these influences in health and disease. Now, the universally accepted factors are the phenols, aldehydes, that causes the health and disease of at least half of our 5 billion subjects. Now, what's causing this sunspot activity? If you look, by the way, these slides are out of the hardcore medical scientific literature. They're not coming out of the National Enquirer. We see here the influence of planetary position on solar activity. The upper curve is the disposition of Jupiter, Earth, Venus, and Mercury relative to the Sun. The lower curve is the sunspot activity. Here we have a one-to-one correlation. Why are we looking at pharmaceuticals as modulators of health? Eldon described the billions of megatons of atomic energy equivalent that are liberated in solar flare and sunspot activity. This is the Earth, showing it relative to the size of this activity on the Sun. What happens is the sunspot, the solar flare, among many other things, transmits these ionized particles, which are captured in the north and south geomagnetic poles, causing things that have been known for years, like the aurora borealis, the northern and southern lights. And we have now another curve on the mortality diseases of the nervous system in Moscow from 1924 to 27 on the sunspot activity. Why are we trying to develop drugs to handle these, all of which have side effects, when the entire answer may appear in electromagnetics. How about deaths from epidemic meningitis? Okay. How about epileptic attacks? That's to be expected because that's an electrical disturbance in the brain. Epileptic attacks and suicides, okay, and more of the same. There are literally thousands of open literature references showing these correlations. Now this one happens to be total daily deaths from 1932 from angina pectoris, etc. Heart attacks follow precisely these lunar and solar cycles electromagnetically. Tuberculosis, cholera in Russia, lower curve, solar activity, same period. We could go on with literally thousands of these slides which appear in the medical literature. Mortality from nervous and cardiovascular diseases. Now, let's take this out of the realm of the esoteric and get it into the realm of something on which we can get a handle. In order to actually utilize this information, number one, we have to detect it. Is something going on? We can't depend on a handful of psychics, although they have done tremendous duty in contributing to these investigations. We have to measure it with scientific instruments that any two people can see and agree on without any subjective interpretation. It is nice if we can locate the source and direction of these invisible influences, these subtle energies, and as Eldon has shown you here, we have to record this data so it can be analyzed, correlated with whatever else is happening on our planet. Now, my interest was captured by the government-funded study done by Drs. Polk and Drs. Fitchen at the University of Rhode Island to detect the actual presence of the Schumann resonance. This coil in this cement coffin to keep the wind from blowing it and moving it in the Earth's field was set up in 1962. Tremendous surprise. These tracings, which were published in the U.S. Bureau of Standards, Division of Radio Propagation, 1962 journal, are identical to human brain waves. In fact, Drs. Polk and Fitchen took these around to encephalographic clinicians and said, diagnose this patient. Wow, here we have a burst of alpha wave, and here we have some theta, and here we have some delta spiking. Then they told them this is the brain wave of the Earth itself. This is the electromagnetic energy in the Earth ionosphere cavity. Now, where does this happen? Average resonance frequency spectra obtained during the day, the solid curve, and at night, 7.81 to 7.83 hertz. Next slide. And if anyone has gotten into this esoteric argument about what precisely is the mean median mode Schumann resonance that is beneficial, here's 7.7 hertz is the median. It never goes above 7.9. Well, it can, but in very rare instances. The second harmonic of this averages between 14.1 and about 13.0. In other words, all of these data have been lying around in the rather esoteric scientific journals since 1962. What kind of power levels are we talking about? Down here, the frequency in hertz, we are looking at something like a field strength of, where we're looking here is 10 hertz, which is right about here. This is the spectra to which men, women, children, and animals are sensitive, between 0.001 and 0.002 gamma. Until recently, there were no instruments that would measure influences, occult influences of that low a level. Next slide. Now, this is one of the most fascinating classified papers that I can show you. The reason I can show you this paper is because I got it before it was classified. The work was done by a Dr. Hamer in 1965, at the time he was wandering the halls of UCLA, giving people hamburgers if they'd come in and let him measure their reaction time. Now, I'm going to do this to you guys in a few minutes, so fasten your seatbelts. He pasted a piece of Reynolds aluminum foil on the ceiling, put another one on the floor, connected it to the output of a sine wave generator that was putting out little electrical signals. The voltage levels were 0.2 of a volt, 0.02 and 0.002 of a volt, root mean square. Next slide. What he found here was something that has turned the industrial, military, government, CIA, DIA, NSA on its little tokus. The effect of man-made signals on human beings to increase or decrease performance. At about 9 hertz, the reaction times were shortened. Next slide. At 3 to 5 hertz, the delta spiking frequency of an epileptic, what happens? Reaction times are dramatically increased, performance is decreased at voltages that were so low that you could not measure them at fields in the open space unless you had an electrometer that costs about $3,000. Now, Crusader Rabbit doesn't like to buy $3,000 toys because I've paid for all of this research out of my own pocket. The rumor that I have ever worked for the government is a flat-out lie, and the guy that says it again, and we know who it is, I think I'm going to sue for slander, except I have too much respect for his past work. I am not now, nor have I ever been a government agent, CIA, FDA. I'm not even a Martian. I've been accused of that. A lot of people seem like they're out to get me, but for about $15 worth of parts that you can buy at any Radio Shack store in the United States, you can build an instrument, one of many, and can we turn on the house lights for a minute, and I'm going to freak some of you out here, that will go in your pocket instead of being run around in a relay rack. And what I'm going to do here is something magical. When I'm doing an all-day seminar, we have a great big meter so the people in the back row can see this, but you'll have to take my word for it. I'm going to pick up here a scripto pencil. And you'll notice when I wave it around this electrometer, this electrostatic voltmeter, not much is happening. I'm going to do something magical to this pencil. I'm going to put a few extra electrons on it, like you did in high school. Now what happens? Number one, when I have charged this piece of plastic by rubbing it through my hair, as you do with a hair comb during the day, we have made a field which you can measure if you have an instrument. Now I'm going to do something else to you. I want the people from the first row back, I guess some of you even a little beyond the video camera are going to feel this. This works double blind, this is not suggestion. We're going to create a 3 to 5 hertz field, as Hamer did at UCLA in 1965, and we're going to ask you how you feel. Now, we're going to produce a 9 hertz wave. A wave is a time-varying field, and I want those of you who are sensitive to tell me what you feel compared to the 3 to 5. Okay? You got it? I see several faces have lit up here. You felt that? Terrific.
Yeah, the one wave made you feel slightly low. I felt the vibration in the solar plexus.
Yeah.
The second one you did, I felt the energy charge throughout the whole body.
Exactly. If you saw those previous slides, we have replicated here with very simple, do-it-yourself, verifiable on scientific instruments, waves and fields that have profound effect on biological systems. Now we're going to do something a little bit later that'll get you all the way back in the back row. But my mission in life is I'm an iconoclast. I don't believe in spending $100,000 on a research grant when you can do it yourself for $15, get the results, and then do what you want with it instead of try to make the report fit somebody's preconceived idea of reality. This is one of dozens of instruments that we have built and on which we have published schematics and given, not sold, given away to people who have been interested in this type of electromagnetic energy. Okay, kill the house lights and let's go on. This was our first replication of the Schumann detectors of Dr. Polk and Fitchen at the University of Rhode Island. The thing weighed about 55 pounds. We were now able to run around the planet and find out why some houses were sick houses, why some psychics could work better at sacred American Indian medicine grounds than they could in the big city. Next slide. We got this thing compacted by the time the flap happened in Eugene, Oregon, so it would go in a thin briefcase. This was our second generation pickup sensor that Eldon mentioned. At the time of the Eugene, Oregon flap, there were 4 sensors for electromagnetic fields of this low intensity on the planet, and 2 of them were in the trunk of my 1970 Chevy. I drove old cars because I could afford them. Next slide. We were able to tape record. Remember, we have to detect the data, get its direction, get its amplitude, and then run a frequency spectrum analysis on it. We were able to put this information on a little pocket recorder, run it through a discriminator, then into this little Tektronix 211 scope or a chart recorder, and now, thank God, we have a frequency analyzer, spectrum analyzer, and get the data. So when the flap happened in Eugene, Oregon, and hundreds of people were being placed on Dilantin to control epileptic-type seizures because of a signal coming from the Soviet Union thousands of miles away, we were able to make encephalographic recordings, EEG, electroencephalograph, on one channel. By now we had a 4-channel tape recorder, the Schumann resonance or the Soviet ELF wave, and the shortwave receiver tuned to the carrier of the Soviet woodpecker. Next slide. We were now able to have scientific data. Now I throw this in because only a very few years earlier, some scientists carried this Beckman dynograph electroencephalographic machine through India to measure the brain waves of Zen priests and psychics and mystics and Buddhists and what have you. The thing weighed 75 pounds without batteries. We were able, in 1969, to develop an entire electroencephalogram that goes in your shirt pocket that has about 10 times the sensitivity and 100 times better signal-to-noise ratio than the Beckman dynograph. So now we could do some good work without breaking our backs or having a mule to carry around the equipment. If you focus, you'll see the present day 1987 generation. This little coil, which goes in your pants pocket, about the size of your very small can of juice, the little ELF receiver, and any of these small tape recorders that go in your shirt pocket will do a far better, more accurate job, more precise measurements than the thousands of pounds that you will find in laboratories of superconducting squids, etc. So this will give you an idea. They all go in your pocket. This unit in the middle, here it is in real time. We're blown up here about 6-to-1 area. Next slide. So here again, we published these schematics and gave them free to anybody who wanted to replicate the experiments, because some of my results were so controversial that as an ethical scientist, we needed peer review and replication. Today, you can buy a vest pocket-sized stereo recorder. On one channel, you put the human subject's electroencephalogram. On the other, with this device, you can put the magnetic influences in the home or office or shop, whether they're coming from contaminated air conditioning systems or what have you. Next slide. We built little oscilloscopes by modifying a Swiss device that's carried by paramedics that would quite literally go in your pocket instead of carrying huge devices. Next. If you focus that a little in the middle, today or for the last couple of months, we're using these little leader scopes that sell for, well, they retail for about $850. Work 4 hours on one little transistor radio battery. So we can go in and find out what restaurants are modifying your eating habits by giving you an adrenaline reaction, which normally produces fight or flight syndrome. If you paid $20 for a meal, you're not going to fight or run away. You're going to eat faster. If you eat faster, they're going to have more table turnover during a shift. This is being done. We found a number of these locations in Southern California that are doing this to us. Incidentally, they are connected with the family. They are Italian-owned. This technology has leaked down to the public. We hoped it would be a few years before this happened. Next slide. When we began trying to actively manipulate the mood and brain waves of Homo sapiens, we first tried photic stimulus, flashing lights. We tried evoke potential from sound. We tried a number of things about which we do not talk in public. We finally developed a little device about this size that goes in your shirt pocket. I took it down, now I'm telling on myself, but I hope the statute of limitations has run out, to a couple of the major tourist attractions in Southern California, where we would have an unlimited number of subjects, free, doesn't have to feed laboratory mice. We determined that we could alter the brain patterns of about 35% of the gross population up to a distance of around 20 to 30 feet. Instead of going through the door, they would run into the door jamb. Instead of walking around the trash can, they would kick it over. They'd get lost. As soon as I found that this actually worked, and I used these to determine the waveforms, pulse repetition rates, etc., I destroyed the units because I felt we were doing a highly unethical thing. So I hied myself back to Washington and I said, hey, you guys, we've got a clear and present danger. Next slide. In order to run carefully controlled experiments, we have to know what our frequency is and we have to know what the amplitude is, the waveform, the pulse repetition rate. So we bought these little FM7s made by Nonlinear Systems. The glasses are in the picture to show you that we really like portable stuff. And the older I get and the worse my knees get, the lighter my suitcase has to be if I'm going to do it with a smile on my face. And we put on the back a little times 100 multiplier. So we can now look down at frequencies of 100th of a hertz resolution. And here's where we began getting the data. All of the reports, most of the reports in the literature were plus or minus 1 hertz. Well, that ain't where it is, baby. Your nervous system is so incredibly sensitive that it can detect signals of 100th of a hertz variation. Just like your radio set, as you tune across the band, if it's highly selective, we'll get different stations, hundreds of them in one short wave band. Next. Now, the one that the government got me out of pasture to look at was socio-political mass disturbances on some of these electromagnetic cycles. Next slide. Could these things be used for mass mood control, crowd control, an alternative weapon to atom bombs, etc.? So when the mystery signal was discovered in Eugene, Oregon, and this was on March 26, 1978, Register Guard. Next slide. It made headlines all across the United States for 3 days, and then there was a total news blackout, which will tell us an awful lot. By their holes shall we know them. By their frogs shall we know them. Slide. Here's Crusader Rabbit, Marshall Van Oort, the health physicist from the University of Oregon, and Dr. Kay Prince, who is the radiological chief of the state of Oregon. And down here on the fireplace, you can see our little ELF detectors. This device right here is the one that we can demonstrate if we have time later. First day out, I thought we had a city full of hypochondriacs. Nothing. Next slide. Next day, we took the data back, we made some more recordings, took them back to the University of Oregon, and on April 29th, 1978, we found that the Soviets were transmitting a signal from a transmitter near Minsk, and it was postulated that the OTH was coming from Riga and Gomel. That was several hundred times the Earth's background in which we have evolved. Next slide. So the people up there were worried. Every hypochondriac is coming out of the walls. What are we going to do? They pushed for quick action. They were afraid of population flight. And here's Dr. Prince, the radiological monitor. I could talk to her because I had that job in LA 20, 30 years earlier. The source was traced to the power grid. Why? Because these lines were acting as giant antennas, bringing this electromagnetic energy into the homes. Any of you who own computers know that you put a spike protector on them because these little surges, variations, can bomb your computer, crash your program, right? What about your nervous system? Isn't that thousands of times more sensitive? Finally, Marshall Van Oort, the Western director of the Environmental Protective Agency, arrived in this trailer with, what was it, about $2 million worth of equipment inside? Richtel, I'm sorry, to look for the signal. He got there 2 days after I'd left, couldn't find a thing because he had no instrumentation that looked below about 10 kilohertz, which is where we broadcast to our underwater submarines. Next slides. So Van Oort, who's the guy that brought me up there, and I staked out some equipment. We waited for the FCC to pass judgment on this. The EPA sleuth Richtel traces the mystery signal to a Navy transmitter at Dixon, California at 4.717 megahertz. My God, I don't know where they get these people. Go ahead. A couple of days later, they backed down on naming the signal source. He had nothing that would measure ELF. I later taught him how to build them, and he has some now, and then he totally left my name out of his bibliography when he took credit for the whole thing. What about countermeasures? Are these problems real, or are they actual? There's a large difference here. Reality is what goes on inside of your own head. It may or may not have anything to do with the actuality in the environment. An example of reality is we had a number of people when I was doing advanced psychology in mental institutions who thought they were Napoleon Bonaparte. That's what they thought. That was their reality. The actuality is he died in 1832, was it, in Elba, probably of arsenic poisoning. So until we can deal with this, we can't use spurious data. Did the dowser have garlic yesterday? Therefore, is only guessing. Garlic will kill your higher psychic centers so that the dowsing results are only subjective. Or do we have something out here that we can measure physically with instrumentation that anyone can agree on? Next. Now, they had known about these things for many years in West Europe. Dr. Ludwig had made these little devices, these magnetic pacers. There's some for sale on the back table here, which are updated at the Skilling Company, not his, but a later design, that people would wear when they began feeling a little bit out of it because of electromagnetic influences. He did studies on chronic headaches, migraine, rheumatic pains, pains from scars, sleep disturbances, travel sickness, traced them all to the electromagnetic spectra, did 20,000 double-blind studies with human subjects in West Germany. We can't do that here because we have these health education and welfare guidelines. So today you will find a number on the open market of these mood pacers, which are for sale to anybody, all comers. This little locket is solar operated. I bought one of these last month from Dr. Ludwig when he was giving the bioenergetic seminar in Los Angeles. Let's see what's inside of these. One of the more interesting instruments is this metronome made by Ludwig. This was an earlier generation. Next. Crusader Rabbit and one of the ELF detectors and Dr. Ludwig out at Andreas Mark's house last month. Looking inside of these magical boxes, the thing which is producing the effect on human health are these magnetic cores. Next slide. Which are excited by a small oscillator circuit, usually a 4011 or even a 555 timer chip. Peter Linderman, who makes a good little box, is using this scalar type antenna, which is wound as a back EMF coil after I.W. Hooper's work, Principia College, about a decade and a half ago. Next slide. Here's a copper penny to give you an idea of the size of a device. Here's the transistor, the capacitors, the solar cell on the opposite side of the locket that people can wear that can alter their response to the biosphere in case we're having a bad day and the animals are hurting and the ants are coming out of the ground and earthquakes are right around the corner. Now, in West Germany, who has a more free choice of modalities, and how are we doing for time here? Oh, good grief. Have I talked all that and said nothing? They are making magnetic cores which have been implanted with ions. About 30 trace minerals are implanted by high voltage implantation bombardment. This device is the Indumed, which is curing diseases with electromagnetic energies and rates instead of pharmaceuticals. It has recently been discovered, and since I've heard it from 3 separate sources, we're not breaking any confidentiality here, that it was discovered when an electromagnetic beam of laser light was passed through the field of a samarium cobalt magnet, and the juxtaposition of these 2 fields, at this juxtaposition was interjected a pharmaceutical. A culture plate downstream of this acted as though this drug or chemical had been put into the culture plate itself. Now that's the end of the pharmaceutical industry as we have known and loved it over the years. Any of those of you who are so behind the times who haven't done it, run, do not walk to the bookstore and get the book, The Body Electric by Dr. Robert O. Becker, who's been nominated twice for the Nobel Prize, but he ain't gonna make it because he tells the truth. He's a little bit irascible, he speaks out, he doesn't want to be bothered with the political ramifications of his discoveries, but this is now in paperback, thank God. We never thought it would be out again. Next slide. Now, this is our friend, Dr. Andrea Puharich, with the electroencephalographic headband. Here's Crusader Rabbit back in about 1977. Next. In one of the best Faraday cages in the United States. Here I am sitting in the corner like a bad boy. Next. What we did is we took a little device that goes in your pocket outside of the cage, had his housekeeper instructed, turn the dial to various frequencies, don't tell us what they are. Over here in this wastebasket full of sand, which acted as a mechanical damper, was a pickup coil for the ELF. We had totally isolated channels going into the recorder. Next slide. Remarkable thing, within about a half a second of the time, and this is the random background of the subject's brainwave, within half a second of the time the oscillator was put on outside of this shielded room, the brainwave of the subject immediately entrained to precise frequency, phase. In other words, we had changed the subject's brainwave through a shield with a device that put out 83 milliwatts of power, far less than your little pocket transistor radio. Next slide. This held over a rather wide if you came up here, you would find that the peaks and valleys corresponded over this entire incident. Next. Regardless of the frequency, as long as you were within a rather critical window, next, we were altering the biological responses of a human being with a little device that you could stick in your pocket. Next. So it was a windy day. I hadn't had time for a haircut. And Dr. Puharich and I approached the United Nations. And on April 6, 1977, we did a briefing. We were allowed 45 minutes. The briefing went 2.5 hours because these people thought, who the hell were these kooks? Now, what are the possible interactive mechanisms? We now know a lot more about scalar waves than we did in 1977. They are fields. They are not power phenomena. Now listen carefully. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. There was about 40 decibels difference between those two utterances, but the whisper, 1, 2, 3, carried the identical information as the shout. Our scientific community believes that it is a power vector unless it heats you up, unless it's thermal, or unless it's ionizing, it ain't gonna work. What they have not looked at is that man is an information processing intelligent being that responds to fields, and you don't have to push him around with a 2x4. Phase conjugate resonance you're going to be hearing a lot about. I don't want to go into it. It's a 3.5-hour presentation with a lot of mathematics. I hate them, but sometimes you have to do it to impress your peers. Morphogenetic resonance, Bell's theorem, holographic mind models, etc. All of these are now being explored under laboratory replicable conditions. And the discoveries that the fields can carry the information into the nervous system that only a few years ago we felt could only be gotten there with massive doses of chemicals. Wrong. Next slide. If I'm ever nominated for any kind of a prize, it was to prove to the scientific community that the Soviet woodpecker carried a magnetic vector that was psychoactive. And I finally proved this to my own satisfaction on the 25th of May, 1978. These are actual chart recordings. These are the marker signals from the carrier on the woodpecker transmission. These are the H vector signals. When I took this back to Washington and I said, we have a clear and present danger here, that baby isn't an over-the-horizon radar. It probably might be, but it is also psychoactive. They said, you're full of baloney. We've got the best magnetometers in the world. We pay $300,000 for squids, and we've never seen the H vector on a squid. So they arranged for the manufacturer of the best squid in the world, the SHE, Superconductive Helium Enterprises, in San Diego to run a side-by-side test. We had been going around measuring isopotential lines and fields near power lines in Los Angeles every weekend instead of going out to play at the beach. We had found that the Pacific Intertie, the 800 kilovolt line that comes from Bonneville Dam down across the western US that had caused the problem in Eugene, Oregon, terminates here in Sylmar, California. I had found all of the places where I could access these power lines on fire roads, and here's my old Chevy, and we went out with spectrum analyzers, receivers, to get data. But it was pretty primitive then, and it's come a long way since. Okay, next. So here we are on this wooden platform because they'd had to dig out a hole underneath the squid because there were so many ferrous materials in the dirt. And here were my first, or I guess second generations of ELF detectors. This stainless steel thermos jug had liquid helium. The squid was submerged in this. Here's the president and chief engineer of the SHE Corporation and all of this equipment that connects to the squid. And down here is my little detector. All the rest of that stuff was theirs. Next. We were looking for the woodpecker. I had a mustache then. Next. Okay, keep going. I got the back up one there. I got the woodpecker with all of their narrow band pass filtration and amplification, they got noise. So I had proved my point. I was seeing a valid phenomena. I had made a device on my kitchen table that was about 100 times more sensitive than a $300,000 squid, and it had cost me about $75, and it didn't require liquid helium. All right? Okay, that opened another hassle of fish here, and I don't think I want to go into my dealings with Sandia, Los Alamos, and White Sands. I was invited up there. They rolled on a truckload of equipment. One truck had the batteries and the cables, which are about this big around. A couple of strong men took the squid out and put it on the ground, and they said, well, Dr. Beck, you were supposed to bring some magnetometers up here. I had on this hunting jacket. It was rather cold in April up there. Oh, yeah. Oh, here's one. Here's the... God, did I have a captive audience. I got the signal from the magnetic event that was being tested a couple of miles away. They didn't. You think that makes a boy unpopular in high places? Okay, go for it. Here's Dr. Rick Tell. Here's the western headquarters of the EPA outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, and here was my then magnetometer. These are Helmholtz coils where he's checking the sensitivity. Next slide. That's my current pickup that we have here at the conference if anyone wants to see it. Next slide. Established the fact on their own instrumentation in the den of the lion here that we were doing what we claimed. It wasn't magic. There's Crusader Rabbit. Keep going. Now, took the thing back to Washington, where the Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, which is commissioned to monitor this stuff, has a shielded room that we taxpayers paid for. Next slide. Here's my magnetometer. Here's the pickup coil. Put it in there, made a measurement with the door open. Closed the door. Got the identical reading, proving that their cage did not shield out scalar or ELF magnetics. Funniest slide in my collection. These guys were furious. Their first reaction was to run to the blackboard to prove to me why it couldn't be done. Okay? Next slide. Okay, keep going. I had found that while I was doing this with no funding, because I wanted to, because I'm as irascible as Becker, some people say, well, there's somebody more irascible than both of us, we haven't found him yet, found that the Central Intelligence Agency had given a large grant to Garrett Air Research Corporation, and some of the big brains in the business, Dr. Wartz, Bauer, Erkins, etc., next slide, had come to the same conclusions, that if the Soviets were working on us, it had to fall in certain windows, namely 7.83 hertz, 14.1, 23, etc. But that's a few $1 million later. I'd done this in the kitchen sink. Next. They postulated a number of mechanisms for this in that some of the cells go superconducting at room temperature. We're kind of running out of time here, so speed her up. Got a little grant to go out to Egypt to find out what the hell was happening because the Soviets had always underbid every possible Westinghouse General Electric bid to put the power equipment in the Upper Aswan Dam. They want to control that power keg, boys and girls, and when they put that magnetic signal out over those light lines, the Middle East is going to jump through their hoop. No other timetable. Next slide. Keep going. This is Andrew McCroskey, Bob Beck. This is Dr. Rauscher. We had a meeting up at the University of Ottawa, tested the equipment. Keep going. Dr. Bill Van Bice. Keep going. Here at the USPA conference a few years ago, I was able to demonstrate absolute control of this lady's brainwaves from the back row with a little device that went in my shirt pocket. You were there, Alden. A lot of people were. Kind of blew minds. There were a lot of critics in the audience. They had to make sure that we weren't doing something up our sleeve. Okay, let's skip the technical stuff because we are getting low on time, but a lot of work is being done here on solitons, scalar interferometry, excellent work by John Adey of Jet Propulsion Lab, Ross Adey at the Veterans Administration Hospital at Loma Linda in California, and let's skip this because it's mathematically provable. Thank God some people are beginning to look at this now, and instead of being a kook, I'm considered a pioneer. Now that's a giant step in this community, but we now have a Bioelectromagnetic Society, which has been meeting since about 1982. We were the guests of the government at this 1983 first international conference on nonlinear electrodynamics and biological systems. What they found here is that these fields do work on rabbits, mice, human beings. Our most interesting result relates to the magnitude of the magnetic intensities that were studied. This comes from the most prestigious scientific publication in the world. In other words, what we were claiming has now become a reality. We could talk about the Lakowski multiple wave oscillator that generates this particular type of nonlinear electromagnetic energy. Some early versions of this. but Clark Kent is doing it. Okay, back up just one. This is fascinating. This is a muscle EMG read off the back of a truck driver that came home on Friday night. He had a whole weekend. He had a six-pack of beer in front of him. This experimenter said, Joe, think about going to work on Monday morning. Well, Joe's here in front of the telly. No outside indicators, but look what happens. His muscles start tensing up. This is a signature of stress. This is the electromagnetic signature of an electromyographic reading of a person who simply thinks about something unpleasant. Harold Saxon Burr, PhD, preceded me by a good 3 or 4 or 5 decades by postulating the fields of life designed for destiny. Go ahead. So we built, well, I'm going to talk about this at another private conference because some of this is so mind-boggling. Next. This is Rupert Sheldrake at the University of Ottawa meeting. Next. So many years ago, back in the late 50s, we replicated an L field meter, found that the man was telling the truth. He could predict the onset of many diseases by the direct current potential at certain spots of the body. Okay, keep going. This is too esoteric. So we designed whole sets of little instruments that'll go in your pocket, that'll do better than Big Brother, and I was going to demonstrate them if we had time, but we don't. These are field strength meters that you can buy on the open market, or you can build your own for $10. These run anywhere from $500 up and down. This one's $800. Don't do it, kids. Get a schematic, go to Radio Shop. Do your own electromagnetic ghostbusting. This thing is $14 at Radio Shack. It'll tell you more about your electromagnetic environment than the EPA can. This is a device coming out of West Germany that I have in the medicine bag here that measures both the E vector and the H vector down here in up to 30 Teslas, which is the window of psychoactivity. Cost about $250. These are the medicine kits of tomorrow. Go ahead. This is a $14 Radio Shack bulk tape eraser. What do you do with it? 90% of the time when you go into a building, you find an orthogonal magnetic field, you trace it to the air conditioner. Next slide. The mirror up here shows the blades of this blower. Next. By taking this degausser, putting them in contact with the blade, slowly rotating it and running it back and forth to erase the magnetic signature, you can cure about 50% of the ills in sick houses. Tom Bearden and Doris were so sick a year ago that they could hardly get around. They had exhausted every antibiotic. I'd left one of my magnetic detectors with Peter Kelly. He took it up from Lakemont, found this humongous field in Tom Bearden's house. Somebody had gotten in there and magnetized a blade on the squirrel cage blower. After that blade was demagnetized, Tom, Doris, everyone in that house got well. Okay? Here's our disclaimer. Because we are visited by the FDA, information is presented for research and investigational purposes only. It is not intended as diagnosis, treatment for any medical condition. See your medical professional or ask the expert FDA investigator on your block if you have any problems. Next slide. Okay, one more, I think. That's it. And did we finish right under the wire? We'd like to have time for questions, but I will not cut into the next person's time. We have all of these instruments for H vector, E, I, magnetic. You can build them yourself for under a month's allowance for beer. And that's it. And thank you for listening.